The galaxy had learned long ago that some boundaries were never meant to be crossed. Commander Ethan Cross had heard the warnings 1,000 times during his briefing sessions aboard the Terran Exodus, the colony ship that had carried him and 15,000 other humans across the void to the Outer Rim territories. The instructors had been clear, their voices edged with the kind of gravity reserved for matters of survival. Respect the customs of the Nyxarian Imperium. Never enter their sacred chambers. Never look upon what is hidden. Never, under any circumstance, violate the ancient protocols that governed interaction between humanity and the vampire lords who ruled the crimson moon of Sangelios Prime. Ethan had listened. He had nodded. He had signed every waiver and memorized every cultural sensitivity document the Terran Diplomatic Corps had thrust into his hands. And yet, here he stood, frozen in the arched doorway of a chamber he should never have entered, his eyes locked upon a sight that would alter the trajectory of his entire existence. The room sprawled before him like something torn from a fever dream, all vaulted ceilings carved from obsidian stone and walls alive with bioluminescent symbols that pulsed in rhythm with an unseen heartbeat. Crimson light bled through crystalline fixtures embedded in the Gothic architecture, casting everything in shades of blood and shadow. Mist curled along the polished black floor, thick and sentient, as though the chamber itself breathed. Silk curtains the color of midnight hung from invisible moorings, their fabric moving in currents of air that shouldn't exist in a sealed environment. And in the center of it all, partially obscured by swirling shadows and cascading veils of translucent silk, stood her. She was a creature of contradictions, alien yet achingly beautiful, terrifying yet magnificent. Her skin glowed with an ethereal luminescence, pale as starlight reflecting off virgin snow, marked here and there with faint traceries of silver that might have been veins or might have been something older, something written into her very DNA by forces beyond human comprehension. Her hair fell in waves of pure white, so long it pooled on the floor around her feet like spilled moonlight. But it was her wings that truly stole Ethan's breath. They rose from her shoulders like the architecture of fallen cathedrals, massive structures of membrane and bone that caught the red ambient light and transformed it into something divine. Each wing stretched wider than Ethan's outstretched arms, their surfaces etched with patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Ancient glyphs, perhaps, or maps of star systems long since consumed by entropy. Her body, though partially concealed by the strategic positioning of shadows and silk, spoke of power barely contained. She was tall, easily matching Ethan's 6-foot frame, with curves that suggested both predatory grace and devastating strength. The flowing curtains clung to her form just enough to hint at what lay beneath while preserving the mystery, the shadows playing across her skin like living guardians of her modesty. And then she turned. Her eyes found him across the expanse of the chamber, and Ethan felt the impact like a physical blow. Those eyes burned crimson, not metaphorically but literally, as though twin stars had taken up residence in her skull and now blazed with the fury of violated sanctity. Her expression twisted through shock, recognition, and then settled into something far more dangerous. Rage tempered by ancient law. You, her voice emerged as something between a whisper and a thunderclap, carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal anatomy. She spoke in Nyxarian, but the translator implant behind Ethan's ear converted it instantly to English, preserving the venom in every syllable. You dare. Ethan's hands shot up instinctively, palms forward in the universal gesture of peace and apology. His mouth opened and closed twice before his brain caught up with his desperate need to explain. I didn't mean to. The corridor, it shifted and the doorway wasn't marked and I was just trying to find the... You have seen. She took a step toward him, and the movement was both hypnotic and terrifying. The mist parted around her feet like subjects bowing before their queen. You have looked upon what is forbidden. The translator gave up on some of her words, leaving them in their original Nyxarian form, but Ethan didn't need the technology to understand her meaning. He had crossed a line, stumbled through a doorway that should have remained forever closed. And now whatever ancient law governed such transgressions would exact its price. I'm sorry, he managed, his voice cracking despite years of military training designed to keep him calm in crisis situations. I swear I didn't know, I would never intentionally. Silence. The word cracked through the chamber like a whip, and Ethan's jaw snapped shut of its own accord. She moved closer, and with each step, the shadows seemed to deepen around her, the silk curtains billowing as though caught in a storm that existed only in her orbit. He could see more details now, the way her claws extended from fingertips that tapered into elegant points, the subtle patterns of silver that traced along her collarbone and disappeared beneath the concealing fabric, the raw power that radiated from her like heat from a forge. She stopped 3 paces away, close enough that he could smell her, a scent like winter nights and ancient roses and something else, something that his human brain couldn't quite categorize but recognized on a primal level as dangerous. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow felt even more threatening than her earlier fury. "Do you comprehend the magnitude of your violation?" Ethan swallowed hard. I've broken some kind of law. A sacred law. Not some law." She tilted her head, and the gesture reminded him of a predator studying prey from a new angle. "The first law. The foundation upon which all relations between your species and mine are built. You have gazed upon a daughter of the Crimson Houses in her private chambers, in her state of seclusion, during the time when flesh and soul are laid bare before the ancient mothers." The translator struggled with several of those concepts, offering approximations that Ethan knew fell woefully short of their true meaning. But he understood enough. He had intruded upon something deeply private, something sacred, something that his presence had irrevocably profaned. "What?" He had to force the words out past the fear constricting his throat. "What happens now?" Her expression didn't soften, but something flickered in those burning eyes, something that might have been resignation or might have been grim determination. "There is only one path forward, human. Only one way to satisfy the blood debt you have incurred and prevent the houses from calling for your execution." Ethan's heart, which had already been hammering against his ribs, kicked into an even higher gear. "Execution? The penalty for your crime is death," she said matter-of-fact as though discussing the weather. "Unless the one whose sanctity has been violated chooses to invoke the right of binding." "The right of what?" She drew herself up to her full height, and her wings spread slightly, casting shadows that swallowed what little light remained between them. "You have seen me as only a bondmate may see me. Therefore you must become my bondmate or you must die. There is no third option." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and absolute. Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing through the fog of shock and terror. "You're saying, I have to marry you?" "Marry." She tested the word, her accent transforming it into something alien and strange. "Your human term for the eternal binding." "Yes. That is what I am saying." Her eyes narrowed. "And before you consider refusal, understand that your death would be merciful compared to what the houses would demand if they learned of this violation and found no binding to sanctify it. They would take you apart slowly, human, piece by piece, and use your suffering to fuel the blood rituals for a decade." Ethan felt the color drain from his face. He wanted to believe she was exaggerating, engaging in some kind of theatrical intimidation tactic. But the absolute certainty in her voice, the cold weight of ancient authority behind her words, told him she was speaking nothing but truth. He tried to find some logical argument, some escape clause, some way to reason through this impossible situation. "I don't even know your name." Something that might have been bitter amusement touched her lips. "You should have considered that before you opened a door that was not meant for you." She paused, then added, "But since we are to be bound by law and blood, you may call me Veilira. Veilira of House Crimson Thorn, third daughter of the Night Eternal, keeper of the Southern Territories, and now, it seems, bondmate to a clumsy human who cannot read warning glyphs." Despite everything, the terror, the impossibility, the sheer surreality of the moment, Ethan felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in his chest. He swallowed it down, recognizing that laughing right now would probably get him killed regardless of any binding rights. "Ethan," he said instead. "Commander Ethan Cross. Terran Colonial Marines assigned to Diplomatic Security Detail." He paused, then added with a trace of desperate humor, "and apparently very bad at reading warning glyphs." Veilira's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. some infinitesimal relaxation of the crushing tension. So, Ethan Cross. She pronounced his name carefully as though testing its weight. You understand what you must choose. The binding with all the obligations and transformations it entails, or death with the honor of knowing your suffering will feed ancient powers. When you put it that way, Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt, the binding sounds almost appealing. Do not jest about this. The steel returned to her voice. The eternal binding is not a human marriage that can be dissolved when passion fades. It is a merging of bloodlines, a yoking of souls, a covenant that will endure for centuries. I will live for 1,000 of your years, perhaps more. If you bind yourself to me, you bind yourself to an existence beyond anything your species was meant to endure. Ethan met her burning gaze and found, to his surprise, that his fear was beginning to transmute into something else. Not courage exactly, but a kind of fatalistic clarity. He thought of the alternative, of the execution she'd described, of the diplomatic incident his death would create. He thought of the mission that had brought him to this remote moon in the first place, the tenuous peace between humanity and the Nyxarian Imperium that depended on mutual respect and careful adherence to protocol. He thought of the woman, the being, standing before him, terrible and magnificent, offering him a choice that was barely a choice at all. Then I choose the binding, he said. I choose you. For a long moment, Veilira simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. So be it. She raised one clawed hand, palm facing the ceiling, and spoke words in ancient Nyxarian that the translator didn't even attempt to convert. The bioluminescent symbols on the walls blazed brighter, responding to her voice, and the mist at their feet began to swirl in patterns that looked almost like writing. The covenant is witnessed, she said, switching back to a language the translator could handle. The debt is answered. When the sun rises over the red horizon, we will stand before the assembled houses, and the binding will be made formal. Her eyes locked onto his with renewed intensity. Until then you will remain here in my chambers under my protection. If you leave before the ritual is complete, the debt reverts, and the houses will have the right to claim you. Ethan nodded, understanding the implication. He was a prisoner as much as a guest, held by ancient law in the rooms of a woman, a creature he'd met less than 5 minutes ago. A woman who would become his wife when the sun rose. One more thing, Veilira said, and now her voice carried a note he couldn't quite identify. You have seen me in a state of exposure that binds you by law. But I have not yet seen you with the same intimacy. The binding must be reciprocal, human. Before the ritual, I must be granted the same vision you were granted, however accidentally. It took Ethan's exhausted, overwhelmed brain a moment to process her meaning. When it did, his eyes widened. You're saying you need to see me? As you saw me. There was no humor in her voice, no embarrassment. Just ancient law making its demands. The debt must balance. The exposure must be mutual. That is the way of the binding. Ethan felt heat rise to his face despite everything. He'd been shot at, survived decompression events, faced down hostile forces across 3 star systems, and somehow the idea of standing vulnerable before this terrifying, beautiful creature, scared him more than any of it. But he'd made his choice. And in the grand scheme of impossible things he'd agreed to, this was just one more. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. When? Veilira's expression softened. Just barely, just enough to remind him that beneath the ancient power and alien nature, there was something like understanding. Not now. You are exhausted, terrified, and overwhelmed. The binding demands many things, but it does not demand cruelty. She gestured to a shadowed alcove where Ethan could just make out the shape of a resting platform covered in dark fabrics. Sleep first. Recover your strength. When you wake, we will begin the preparations, and I will explain what you must know about the life you have chosen. Ethan wanted to argue that he was too wired to possibly sleep, that his mind was spinning too fast to allow for rest. But the moment she mentioned it, the exhaustion hit him like a physical wave, the adrenaline crash combining with the emotional overload to turn his limbs to lead. Thank you, he managed. Veilira inclined her head slightly, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been dismissal. Then she turned away, her wings folding against her back, the shadows and silk moving to conceal her once more as she retreated to another part of the chamber. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, trying to convince himself this was real, that he hadn't simply had a psychotic break and hallucinated this entire encounter. But the cold stone beneath his feet, the lingering scent of roses and winter, the fading echo of her voice, all of it was too vivid, too present to be anything but genuine. He was going to marry an alien vampire princess. He was going to bind his soul to a creature of shadow and blood and ancient power. And somehow he had to find a way to survive it. Ethan woke to the sensation of being watched. His eyes snapped open, military training overriding the grogginess of deep sleep, and he found himself staring up at a ceiling of carved obsidian that seemed to writhe with reflected light. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the events of the previous night came crashing back with the force of a tactical strike. The door. The chamber. The woman, Valira, standing revealed in shadows and silk. The ultimatum. The choice. The binding. He sat up slowly, his body stiff from sleeping in his uniform on an alien resting platform that, despite its exotic appearance, had somehow been more comfortable than his bunk aboard the Terran Exodus. The chamber looked different in what he assumed was daylight, though the illumination came not from windows but from the bioluminescent symbols that now glowed with a softer amber hue rather than their previous crimson intensity. Valira stood near one of the Gothic archways, fully clothed now in a gown of midnight blue that seemed to be woven from liquid shadow. The garment covered her from neck to floor, long sleeves extending over her hands, but it somehow managed to be both modest and devastating, clinging to her form in ways that suggested everything while revealing nothing. Her wings were partially folded against her back, their tips dragging slightly on the floor behind her. She turned as he rose to his feet, those crimson eyes assessing him with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously exposed and strangely protected. "You slept 4 hours," she said without preamble. "The binding ceremony will begin at sunset, which gives us approximately 10 hours to prepare you." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the last cobwebs of sleep. "Prepare me how? You cannot enter the binding as you are, ignorant, unprepared, and unaltered." She moved toward him with that predatory grace that seemed inherent to her species, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "The eternal binding is not simply a declaration of intent. It is a transformation. Your blood will be mingled with mine. Your lifespan will be extended to match my own, or as close as your human physiology can manage. Your body will be marked with the sigils of House Crimsonthorn, and your soul will be bound to mine through channels that your scientists do not even have names for." Each statement hit Ethan like a hammer blow. He'd known, abstractly, that the binding would be significant, but hearing the specifics laid out in Valira's matter-of-fact tone made it real in a way that terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. "How long will I live?" he asked, latching onto the one detail his mind could begin to process. "Unknown." Valira tilted her head slightly. "Humans who have undergone the binding in the past have lived anywhere from 2 to 5 centuries. Your biology resists the full transformation. Some fundamental aspect of your genetic code fights against the changes the binding introduces. But you will not age as you would have. You will not sicken as easily. And you will heal from injuries that would have killed you before. Have there been many humans who've been bound to your people? 17 in the last 1,000 years." Her expression remained neutral. "Most were diplomats or explorers who, like you, stumbled into situations where the binding was offered as an alternative to death. 3 were individuals who sought the binding deliberately, believing it would grant them power." Her lips curved slightly. "Those 3 did not survive the first decade. The binding is not kind to those who approach it with selfish intent." Ethan filed that information away, trying to ignore the cold weight it added to his stomach. "And the others? The ones who stumbled into it? Most adapted. Some thrived. 2 went mad and had to be," she paused, searching for the right word, "released from their bondage." "Released? You mean killed?" "I mean granted the mercy of ending an existence that had become unbearable to them." Valira's voice held no apology. "The binding is eternal, Ethan Cross, but even eternity recognizes that there are fates worse than death. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Ethan wanted to ask more, about those who'd gone mad, about what specifically had broken them, about whether she thought he would be among those who adapted or those who succumbed. But before he could formulate the questions, Valira spoke again. But we are not here to discuss failures. We are here to ensure you survive the night ahead. She gestured to a doorway he hadn't noticed before, one that had been concealed by the flowing shadows and was now visible in the softer light. Come. There is much to do, and the first step is to make you presentable to the assembled houses. Ethan followed her through the archway and into a space that was part bathroom, part alchemical laboratory, part ritual chamber. The walls were lined with shelves containing bottles and vials of liquids in every conceivable color, while the center of the room was dominated by a circular pool carved directly into the black stone floor. Steam rose from the water, which glowed with a faint blue luminescence. The purification bath, Valira explained, noting his stare. You will immerse yourself completely. The waters contain compounds that will begin preparing your body for the transformation, cleansing your blood of impurities, strengthening your cellular walls, and sensitizing your nervous system to the energies that will flow through you during the binding. Ethan approached the pool cautiously, peering into its depths. The water looked inviting despite its otherworldly glow, and after hours of wearing the same uniform through crisis and sleep, the prospect of being clean held genuine appeal. How long do I need to stay in? Until the water tells you it is finished. At his confused look, Valira elaborated. The glow will fade when the compounds have been absorbed. It typically takes 30 to 40 minutes for a human physiology. Ethan nodded, then realized the obvious problem. You're going to stay while I am your bondmate, Valira said, her tone making it clear this was a statement of fact rather than a request. There can be no modesty between us, not after tonight. And you forget, the debt of vision must be balanced. I must see you as you saw me. This is as appropriate a time as any. Heat flooded Ethan's face, and he was suddenly, acutely aware of the enormous cultural and biological gulf between them. What he considered deeply intimate and private, she viewed as a simple legal requirement, a box to be checked on the path to satisfying ancient laws. Right? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. The balance. He turned his back to her, a small, probably futile gesture of retained dignity, and began removing his uniform. The jacket came off first, then the tactical vest, then the undershirt that was stiff with dried sweat. His boots and pants followed, each removed with mechanical efficiency as he tried very hard not to think about the fact that an impossibly beautiful, impossibly powerful alien vampire was watching his every movement. When he finally stepped out of his final layer of clothing and turned to face her, holding his hands loosely at his sides in a conscious effort not to cover himself, he found Valira studying him with the same clinical intensity she might have applied to a particularly interesting star chart. You are built sturdily for your species, she observed, her eyes traveling over his form without any trace of embarrassment or desire, just assessment. Muscular but not excessively. Your scars? She stepped closer, and Ethan fought the urge to flinch as she traced a clawed finger along a burn mark on his left shoulder, careful not to break the skin. You have survived violence. Occupational hazard of military service? Ethan managed, his voice strained. She completed her examination and stepped back, nodding once. The balance is achieved. You may enter the water. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He descended the carved steps into the pool, gasping slightly as the heated water enveloped him. It felt incredible, not just warm but somehow alive, tingling against his skin with a sensation that was almost electric. He sank down until the water reached his shoulders, then tilted his head back and tried to focus on anything other than his nakedness and vulnerability. Valira settled onto a bench carved from the same black stone as the pool, her wings arranging themselves behind her with unconscious grace. For a long moment she simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice softer than before. You are afraid. It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered anyway. Terrified. Good. Fear will keep you cautious during the ceremony. Those who approach the binding with arrogance or false confidence often make mistakes that cost them dearly. She paused. But you should know. I do not relish this situation any more than you do. Ethan looked at her sharply, surprised by the admission. You don't? I am third daughter of House Crimson Thorn, Vaelira said, and for the first time, he heard something like frustration in her voice. I was courted by princes of 5 different houses. I had my choice of bondmates from among the most powerful bloodlines in the Imperium. I was 3 years away from the traditional time of choosing, and I had finally narrowed my options to 2 candidates who were both politically advantageous and personally tolerable. Her eyes fixed on him. And now I am bound by law and honor to a human who stumbled through the wrong door. The words stung even though Ethan recognized the truth in them. He'd ruined her plans, disrupted her life, forced her into a position she'd never chosen. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I really am. If there were any other way. There is not. Vaelira cut him off, but her tone wasn't unkind. And dwelling on what cannot be changed is a waste of energy. She leaned forward slightly. But we must be clear with each other, Ethan Cross. This binding is a legal necessity, not a love match. I do not know you. I do not particularly like what I have seen so far. You are clumsy, ignorant of basic protocols, and painfully human. And I suspect you view me with a mixture of terror and exotic fascination that has nothing to do with who I actually am. Ethan couldn't deny any of it. He nodded slowly. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice about what kind of bondmates we will be, Vaelira said. The binding is eternal, but the nature of that eternity is up to us. Some bonded pairs become genuine partners, building lives and legacies together. Others remain strangers who simply share a mystical connection and legal status. And some, she trailed off, but Ethan could fill in the blank. Some go mad, he finished. Some go mad, she confirmed. Usually because they fight the bond, or because they enter it with expectations that can never be met, or because the sheer weight of mismatched cultures and lifespans crushes them. Her gaze held his. I do not wish to be bonded to someone who goes mad, Ethan Cross. So I propose we approach this practically. We will fulfill the legal requirements. We will be civil to each other. And we will see if, over time, something more than obligation develops. Can you agree to that? It was possibly the most unromantic proposal of partnership Ethan had ever heard, and yet there was something almost comforting about its honesty. No false promises, no pretending their situation was anything other than what it was. Just 2 people trapped by circumstance, trying to make the best of an impossible situation. I can agree to that, he said. Vaelira nodded, and something that might have been respect flickered in her crimson eyes. Then we have a foundation. It is more than some bonded pairs start with. They remained in silence after that, Ethan soaking in the pool while the glowing water worked its mysterious alchemy on his cells, and Vaelira sitting watch like an honor guard over a prisoner who was simultaneously her captive and her salvation. Slowly, as she'd predicted, the blue luminescence began to fade, the water turning clear and ordinary, or as ordinary as anything in this place could be. When the last of the glow had vanished, Ethan emerged from the pool, and Vaelira handed him a length of dark fabric that turned out to be incredibly soft and absorbent. He dried himself quickly, acutely aware that the brief moment of being observed was over but that the memory of it would linger. Now, Vaelira said, producing a garment he hadn't seen her carrying, you must dress for the ceremony. Human clothing is not appropriate for a binding ritual. The outfit she handed him was unlike anything Ethan had ever worn. A combination of fitted trousers and a long coat, all in shades of deep crimson and black that matched Vaelira's house colors. The fabric felt like silk but moved like liquid, adjusting to his body as he put it on. Intricate patterns were embroidered along the seams, the same bioluminescent symbols he'd seen on the chamber walls, though dormant for now. These will activate during the binding, Vaelira explained, watching him dress. They will glow in response to the energies being channeled, allowing witnesses to see that the transformation is proceeding correctly. Ethan finished fastening the coat, which closed with hidden clasps that sealed themselves at his touch. He looked down at himself and barely recognized the figure he cut, no longer a human military officer, but something that could almost pass for a member of Vaelira's world. Almost. One final element, Veilira said. She approached him and without asking permission, reached up and pressed her palm against the left side of his chest, directly over his heart. Her hand was cold, and Ethan felt a jolt of energy surge from her touch into his body. He gasped, and when she withdrew her hand, he looked down to see a mark on his skin beneath the fabric, a sigil that glowed faintly crimson visible through the clothing. The mark of House Crimson Thorn, she said. Temporary for now, but it will become permanent during the binding. It marks you as mine and me as yours. No one who sees it will doubt your status. Ethan touched his chest, feeling the warmth radiating from the mark. Does it hurt? Not unless the bond is threatened or damaged. Veilira turned away, moving toward the doorway. Come. There are still preparations to be made, and the sun is already beginning its descent. The great hall of House Crimson Thorn was a cathedral of darkness and beauty, a space so vast that its far walls disappeared into shadow despite the hundreds of floating lights that drifted through the air like captive stars. Columns of black stone rose to support a ceiling lost in murk, each carved with the faces of ancient vampires whose eyes seemed to follow movement through the chamber. The floor was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the lights above and creating the disorienting illusion of walking through an inverted sky. Ethan stood at the threshold of this impossible space, Veilira at his side, and tried to control his breathing. The preparation had taken hours, instruction in the proper responses during the ritual, practice with the movements he would need to make, explanations of the significance of each element of the ceremony. His head swam with information. His chest ached where the temporary mark pulsed in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. And now, as the last light of the red sun faded beyond the Gothic windows, it was time. Remember, Veilira murmured, her voice for his ears alone, speak only when prompted. Move only when I move. Do not flinch from the pain. Showing weakness during the binding will be seen as an insult to the house and may void the protection the ceremony offers you. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. Then, before he could second-guess himself into paralysis, he followed Veilira into the hall. The assembled houses were waiting for them. They lined the hall on both sides, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of vampires of every conceivable description. Some looked almost human, differing only in the pallor of their skin and the crimson of their eyes. Others were clearly alien, their forms twisted by centuries of genetic modification or magical alteration into shapes that defied easy categorization. Wings, horns, extra limbs, skin covered in scales or fur or patterns of luminescent symbols. The diversity was staggering and terrifying. All of them watched in absolute silence as Veilira led Ethan down the center of the hall toward a raised dais where three figures waited. Even among this gathering of the extraordinary, those three commanded attention. They radiated power the way stars radiated heat, and Ethan knew without being told that he was looking at the leadership of House Crimson Thorn. The central figure was a woman who might have been Veilira's older sister, though her eyes held the weight of centuries that no human could ever accumulate. She wore a gown of pure crimson that seemed to be woven from liquid blood, and her wings, even larger than Veilira's, spread behind her like a throne of shadow. To her right stood a male vampire of indeterminate age, his features sharp and cruel, his gaze assessing Ethan with the cold calculation of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the effort of the hunt. To her left, another woman, this one appearing younger but somehow more dangerous, her smile revealing fangs that caught the floating light and threw it back in rainbow refractions. Lady Serapha, Veilira said, bowing her head to the central figure. First daughter and regent of House Crimson Thorn. I bring before you the human Ethan Cross, who has invoked the right of binding to answer the debt of violated sanctity. Lady Serapha's eyes moved from Veilira to Ethan, and he felt the weight of her regard like physical pressure against his chest. So this is the clumsy human who could not read a warning glyph. Her voice was surprisingly pleasant, almost amused. Tell me, Ethan Cross of Terra, do you come before the assembled houses of your own free will, understanding the fullness of what the eternal binding entails? This was his first required response. Ethan kept his voice steady as he recited the words he'd been taught. I come of my own will, Lady Serapha, seeking to honor the debt I have incurred and to bind myself to Veilira of House Crimsonthorn for as long as my life persists and her honor requires. And do you understand that the binding will transform you, body and soul? That you will no longer be fully human, but neither will you be Nyxarian? That you will walk between worlds belonging fully to neither. I understand and accept this transformation. Lady Serapha nodded slowly. Then let it not be said that House Crimsonthorn does not honor the ancient laws. Let it not be said that we reject the right of binding when it is properly invoked. She spread her hands and the floating lights throughout the hall began to pulse in unison, their rhythm matching the mark on Ethan's chest. Let the ceremony begin. What followed was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, a ritual that seemed to exist at the intersection of magic, science, and something far older than either. Veilira and Ethan were guided to the center of the dais, where a circle had been inscribed in silver that glowed in response to their presence. They stood facing each other, close enough that Ethan could see the faint silver tracings in Veilira's skin pulse with her heartbeat. Lady Serapha began to chant in ancient Nyxarian, and this time the translator didn't even try to convert the words. They were too old, too laden with meanings that human language couldn't contain. The other vampires joined in, their voices creating harmonics that seemed to bypass Ethan's ears and resonate directly in his bones. Veilira extended her right hand, palm up, and Ethan mirrored the gesture as he'd been taught. The cruel-faced male vampire, whom Ethan now recognized as some kind of blood priest, approached with a blade that looked like it had been forged from crystallized shadow. He spoke a single word, and the blade flared with crimson light. Then he drew it across Veilira's palm, opening a cut that welled with blood so dark it looked black in the pulsing light. The priest turned to Ethan and there was a moment, a single crystallized instant, where every instinct Ethan possessed screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but allow this stranger to cut him with a weapon that hummed with alien power. But he held still, and the blade traced across his palm, and the pain was immediate and shocking, far worse than any cut had a right to be. It felt like fire and ice simultaneously, like the blade had opened not just his skin but something deeper, some layer of reality that existed beneath the flesh. His blood welled up, recognizably red, human red, not the dark near black of Veilira's, and the priest positioned their hands so that their blood mingled, dripping together onto the silver circle beneath their feet. The moment the combined blood touched the inscribed silver, the world exploded into sensation. Ethan felt Veilira's presence slam into his consciousness like a battering ram, felt her thoughts and memories and emotions flood through the connection opening between them. It wasn't telepathy, not exactly, but it was far more intimate than any communication he'd ever experienced. He felt her shock at the intensity of the connection, felt her struggle to maintain her composure as his own human thoughts and memories crashed into her awareness with equal force. He felt her fear, carefully hidden but present nonetheless, that the binding might fail, that his human physiology might reject the transformation and leave them both trapped in a half-completed ritual. He felt her grief for the future she'd planned, the partner she'd been considering, the life that would never be. And beneath all of that, he felt something else, a fierce determination to make this work, to honor the laws of her house and her people, to find a way forward even if the path ahead was nothing like what she'd envisioned. The blood priest continued his chanting, and the other vampires' voices rose in response. Ethan felt his mark burn hotter, felt something begin to change in his cellular structure as the mingled blood worked its transformation. His DNA was being rewritten, his metabolism adjusted, his lifespan extended through mechanisms he couldn't begin to understand. It hurt. God, it hurt worse than anything he'd ever experienced, worse than the shrapnel wound that had nearly killed him in the Kepler conflict, worse than the decompression training that had left him gasping and broken. But he didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. He met Veilira's eyes across the space between them and saw his own determination reflected back at him, saw her fighting through her own pain, because yes, the binding was affecting her too, forcing her to accommodate his foreign presence in her bloodline, to make space in her long existence for this unexpected human. The ceremony reached its crescendo, the chanting becoming almost musical, the lights pulsing so fast they became a solid glow. Lady Serapha raised her hands and her voice cut through all the others. By blood shared, by souls bound, by the ancient laws of the Crimson Houses, I declare this binding complete. Valeira of House Crimson Thorn and Ethan Cross of Terra, you are now bondmates, eternal and indivisible. Let none question this union. Let none stand between you. What has been joined under the red sun can only be sundered by death itself. The silver circle beneath their feet flared with blinding light, and Ethan felt something lock into place. Some fundamental change that went beyond the physical, beyond the genetic, into the realm of the metaphysical. He was bound to Valeira now, truly and completely, in ways that human marriage could never approximate. And then, as quickly as it had built, the intensity faded. The light stopped pulsing, the chanting ceased, and the pain in Ethan's chest diminished to a warm, constant presence that he somehow knew would never fully disappear. He looked down at his hand. The cut had healed, leaving behind a scar that glowed faintly silver. When he touched his chest, he felt the permanent mark that had replaced the temporary one, House Crimson Thorn's sigil, now and forever a part of his flesh. Valeira's palm bore a matching silver scar, and when he met her eyes, he saw something different there. Not warmth exactly, not affection, but a kind of recognition. She could feel him now, feel his presence in the back of her mind like a constant awareness. And he could feel her, a cool, powerful presence that had taken up residence in a part of his consciousness he hadn't known existed. They were bound. They were married. They were, for better or worse, stuck with each other for the next several centuries. "It is done," Lady Serapha said, and now there was approval in her voice. "Welcome to House Crimson Thorn, Ethan Cross. May your bond bring strength to our bloodline and honor to both your peoples." The assembled vampires erupted into what Ethan assumed was applause, a sound like wind through dead trees, eerie and unsettling to his human ears but clearly meant as celebration. Valeira bowed to Lady Serapha, and Ethan hastily copied the gesture. Then, as the crowd began to press forward to offer formal congratulations, Valeira leaned close and whispered in his ear, "You survived the binding. That is further than some make it. Whatever comes next, know that you have at least proven you are not entirely weak." Coming from her, it was practically a declaration of affection. The celebration that followed the binding ceremony was a surreal experience that would have tested Ethan's sanity under normal circumstances. Vampires from dozens of houses approached to offer their formal congratulations, each greeting more elaborate and protocol-heavy than the last. Some seemed genuinely pleased by the union, viewing it as an interesting diplomatic development between humans and Nyxarians. Others made no secret of their disdain, their expressions conveying clearly that they viewed Ethan as a lesser being who'd somehow snared a daughter of a great house through accident rather than merit. Through it all, Valeira remained at his side, her presence both protective and proprietary. Whenever someone's disdain crossed into outright insult, she would respond with cutting remarks delivered in ancient Nyxarian that the translator couldn't quite capture but that left the offending party suitably chastened. Ethan began to understand that whatever her personal feelings about their forced union, she would defend his honor publicly, because his honor was now inextricably linked with hers. The feast itself was an education in alien biology and culture. The foods offered ranged from things that looked almost familiar to dishes that defied description and sometimes basic physics. Valeira quietly guided him away from items that would have been toxic to his human but changing physiology, steering him instead toward proteins and compounds that would help his body adjust to its new state. "You will need to feed differently now," she explained in a quiet moment between courses. "Not blood. The binding doesn't make you a vampire in the traditional sense. But your body will crave certain minerals and proteins it never needed before. Iron especially. And compounds found primarily in dark wine fruits that grow only on the shadowed side of our moon." "Dark wine fruits," Ethan repeated, trying to commit the information to memory even as his exhausted brain protested. "Right. I'll add those to my shopping list." Valeira's lips twitched, not quite a smile but close. "I forget that humans attempt humor as a coping mechanism. It is not entirely unpleasant." Before Ethan could respond to what might have been a compliment, a new figure approached their table, a male vampire whose presence caused a visible ripple through the assembled guests. He was tall, even by Nyxarian standards, with features that could have been carved from marble and eyes that burned with an intensity that made Ethan instinctively straighten his posture. "Lord Kale," Valira said, her voice carefully neutral as she rose to greet him. "I had not heard you would be attending the ceremony. How could I stay away?" Lord Kale's voice was smooth, cultured, and carried an edge that Ethan couldn't quite identify. "When I received word that you had invoked the rite of binding, I had to see for myself." His gaze shifted to Ethan, assessing. "So this is the human who stumbled into your sanctum. How fortunate for him." The pause before "fortunate" was deliberate, loaded with implications that even Ethan's diplomatic training couldn't fully parse. But he understood enough. This was someone who'd been courting Valira, someone who'd been in consideration as her bondmate, someone who now found himself displaced by a human who'd blundered through the wrong door. "Ethan Cross," Valira said, her hand on Ethan's shoulder in a gesture that was part support, part claim of ownership. "This is Lord Kale of House Silverdusk, master of the Northern Territories and keeper of the old bloodlines." Ethan stood and offered the formal bow he'd been taught. "Lord Kale. I'm honored. Are you?" Kale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I wonder, do you understand what you have taken from her? What future you have disrupted with your accident?" "Kale." Valira's voice was low, warning. "The binding is complete. What was is no longer relevant." "Perhaps." Kale's gaze never left Ethan's face. "But the future is very long, especially for those of us who measure our lives in centuries. And bonds, even eternal ones, can be complicated." He leaned closer, and Ethan caught a scent like ozone and ancient stone. "Take care of her, human. And remember that there are those who will be watching, waiting to see if you prove worthy of the honor you've been given." It was a threat wrapped in courtesy, and Ethan felt anger kindle in his chest despite the exhaustion and overwhelming strangeness of everything. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly. "But I'm not going to apologize for surviving. And I'm not going to stand here and let you imply that Valira needs your protection from me." Silence radiated outward from their conversation as nearby vampires tuned in to what was rapidly becoming a confrontation. Kale's eyes widened slightly, surprised perhaps, that this human had dared to push back. Then he laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Spirit. At least she didn't bind herself to a coward." He straightened, inclining his head to Valira. "My lady. I wish you interesting times with your new bondmate." The ancient human curse, delivered with perfect pronunciation. Then he was gone, melting back into the crowd, leaving Ethan's heart hammering and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You should not have provoked him," Valira said, but her voice carried something that might have been approval. "Kale is dangerous when slighted." "I didn't do the slighting. He chose to show up here and make veiled threats." Ethan forced his hands to relax. "If he's one of the vampires I'm supposed to spend centuries being diplomatic toward, we're off to a great start." This time Valira definitely smiled. "He was out of line and you were right to call him on it. The houses respect strength, Ethan. Had you cowered or apologized, you would have lost status that would take decades to rebuild." She paused. "You may survive this life after all." The celebration continued for hours, but Ethan's transformed biology, or perhaps just the sheer psychological toll of the day, was approaching its limits. Valira seemed to sense his flagging energy through the bond that now connected them, and she made their excuses to Lady Serapha, who granted them leave to depart with a knowing smile. "The first night of a new binding," the regent said. "Traditionally a time for the newly bound to become better acquainted." Her expression suggested she knew exactly how non-traditional this particular binding was, and found it amusing. Valira maintained her composure as she guided Ethan out of the great hall and through corridors that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The bond helped him keep his bearings. He could feel Valira's certainty about the path, could sense her intention to return to her chambers, and that knowledge kept him from panicking when the walls seemed to move. They reached the Gothic doorway he'd first stumbled through. Was it only yesterday? It felt like years had passed, and Valira unsealed it with a gesture. The chamber beyond looked different now that Ethan knew it would be his home. Less threatening, perhaps, but no less alien. You will sleep here, Valira said, gesturing to the resting platform where Ethan had collapsed after their first encounter. Your belongings from the Terran ship have been retrieved and placed in that alcove. She pointed to a shadowed recess Ethan hadn't noticed before. In the morning, we will discuss the practical arrangements of our situation. Ethan nodded, then paused. Where will you sleep? Valira gestured to another part of the chamber, one screened off by those ever-present flowing curtains. I have my own resting space. The binding does not require us to share sleeping quarters, particularly in these early days when we are still. She searched for the right word. Adjusting. Right. Adjusting. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling the full weight of everything that had happened. Valira. I know this isn't what you wanted. I know I'm not the bondmate you would have chosen. But I want you to know, I'm going to try. To be worthy of this. To not be the human who broke your life. Valira studied him for a long moment, her crimson eyes unreadable in the chamber's dim light. Then she stepped closer and did something unexpected. She placed her hand over his chest, over the mark that bound them together. I can feel your sincerity, she said softly. Through the bond, I know you mean what you say. That is, not nothing. Her hand remained on his chest, and Ethan became acutely aware of the coolness of her skin, the strength in her fingers, the subtle rise and fall of her own breathing. I will not pretend this is easy for me. I will not pretend I am happy about the circumstances. But you faced the binding without flinching. You stood up to Kale when you could have hidden behind me. And you have not once complained about the impossible situation you find yourself in. Would complaining help? No, a trace of that almost smile touched her lips again. Which is why your restraint is notable. She withdrew her hand, and Ethan felt the loss of contact more keenly than he'd expected. Sleep, Ethan Cross. Tomorrow begins the rest of your very long life. You will need your strength. She turned and moved toward her screened section of the chamber, her wings trailing behind her like shadows given form. Ethan watched her go, then made his way to his own resting area. His belongings had indeed been retrieved. His duffel bag, his spare uniforms, his personal effects, all arranged neatly on a shelf carved from the same black stone as everything else in this place. He changed into sleep clothes mechanically, his mind too full of the day's events to process any single element completely. The binding ceremony. The transformation still working its way through his cells. The confrontation with Lord Kale. The strange, tentative understanding he seemed to be reaching with the woman, the being, who was now his eternal partner. When he finally lay down, he expected sleep to be impossible, expected his racing thoughts to keep him awake for hours. But the moment his head touched the pillow, exhaustion claimed him with the finality of a thrown switch. His last conscious thought, drifting through the haze of sleep, was the awareness of Valira's presence in his mind, distant but constant, cool and powerful, a star he could navigate by even in the darkest night. Ethan woke to pain. It radiated from his chest outward, a burning sensation that felt like his ribcage was being slowly reconstructed from the inside out. He gasped, sitting up too quickly, and the movement sent spikes of agony through his limbs. The mark, the sigil of House Crimson Thorn, was glowing so brightly it cast red light across the chamber. Do not panic. Valira's voice came from beside him, and he turned his head, carefully because everything hurt, to find her sitting on the edge of his resting platform, already dressed in flowing dark garments. The transformation continues. Your body is adapting to the changes the binding introduced. This will pass. How long? Ethan managed through gritted teeth. For most humans, the acute phase lasts 3 to 4 days. You will experience episodes of pain as your cells restructure, your metabolism shifts, and your lifespan extension takes hold. She produced a vial of dark liquid from somewhere in her robes. Drink this. It will ease the worst of it. Ethan took the vial with shaking hands and downed the contents without question. It tasted like concentrated darkness, bitter, cold, oddly substantial, and the effect was almost immediate. The pain didn't disappear, but it became manageable, receding to a dull ache that he could function through. Thank you, he breathed. You are my bondmate. Your suffering reflects poorly on me. Veilira said it matter-of-factly, but Ethan was beginning to recognize that this was how she expressed concern, through practical acknowledgement of their connection rather than emotional declaration. "Can you stand?" Ethan tested his legs and found them willing to support his weight, though everything felt slightly wrong, as though someone had adjusted his sense of proprioception by a few degrees. "Yeah, I can stand." "Good. You have responsibilities today. The Terran Diplomatic Corps has learned of your binding, and they have requested an audience." At Ethan's expression, Veilira's lips quirked upward. "Did you think your own people would simply accept that one of their officers had been bound to a Nyxarian house without seeking explanations?" Ethan hadn't thought about it at all, which in retrospect was a significant oversight. "What do they want?" "To verify you entered the binding of your own free will. To assess whether the arrangement creates diplomatic complications. To determine, I suspect, whether you are a liability or an asset to human Nyxarian relations." Veilira stood, her wings rustling as they settled against her back. "They will meet with us in the formal receiving chamber in 2 hours. That gives you time to make yourself presentable and to prepare for questioning." The next 2 hours were a crash course in political reality. Veilira explained that while the binding itself was legally unassailable, ancient Nyxarian law trumped any human regulations. The Terran Diplomatic Corps would be concerned about appearances, about the message this sent, about the implications for future human interactions with vampire culture. "They will ask if you were coerced," Veilira said as she helped Ethan into formal attire that matched the outfit he'd worn for the binding ceremony. "You must be clear that while the choice was between binding and death, you chose the binding freely and with full understanding of what it entailed." "But I didn't have full understanding. I barely understood half of what was happening." "Nevertheless, that is what you must say." Veilira's hands worked efficiently, fastening clasps and adjusting fabric. "The alternative is to admit weakness and ignorance, which will undermine both your position and mine. We present a united front, Ethan. We are bound by choice and honor, adapting to our new circumstances with dignity. That is the only narrative that serves us." Ethan understood the logic even if it felt like a distortion of the truth. Politics, he was learning, often required such distortions. The formal receiving chamber was less intimidating than the Great Hall but no less impressive. A smaller space with walls lined in what looked like living wood that had been shaped into intricate patterns, and a ceiling that displayed a slowly rotating hologram of the red moon's orbit around its parent planet. 3 humans waited for them, all wearing the formal attire of the Diplomatic Corps, their expressions carefully neutral. Ethan recognized one of them immediately, Ambassador Chin, the head of the human delegation to the Nyxarian Imperium. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but their bearing marked them as senior officials of some kind. "Commander Cross," Ambassador Chin said, her tone professional but not unkind. "And Lady Veilira. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us on such short notice." "Ambassador." Ethan bowed slightly, the gesture automatic from years of military protocol. "I understand you have questions about the binding." Questions would be an understatement. This came from one of the other officials, a man with graying hair and sharp eyes. "Commander, you've been bound to an alien species through a ritual we barely understand, effectively removing yourself from human jurisdiction and placing yourself under Nyxarian law. This creates complications." "I'm aware," Ethan said, keeping his voice level. "But the alternative was execution for inadvertent violation of sacred law. Given those options, the binding seemed preferable." "Walk us through what happened," Ambassador Chin said, settling into one of the chairs arranged in the chamber's center. "How did you come to be in Lady Veilira's private chambers in the first place?" Ethan recounted the story, carefully editing out the more explicit details but maintaining the essential truth. He'd gotten lost, entered a restricted area by accident, and been caught in a situation where ancient law demanded either his death or his binding to the one whose privacy he'd violated. Veilira corroborated his account, adding context about Nyxarian customs that helped the human officials understand why the penalty had been so severe. "And you chose the binding freely?" the sharp-eyed official pressed. "No one forced your hand?" "Define forced," Ethan said. "Was a weapon held to my head?" "No. But I was clearly informed that refusing the binding meant execution." So I chose life and I chose to honor the laws of the culture I was visiting. That seems like the appropriate decision for a diplomatic security officer. Ambassador Chin exchanged glances with her colleagues. Commander, you understand that this binding is permanent. You can't simply divorce Lady Valeira if things don't work out. You're tied to her, and through her to House Crimson Thorn, for the rest of your considerably extended life. I understand that, Ambassador. And you're comfortable with it? Ethan paused, considering his answer carefully. Comfortable isn't the word I'd choose. But I'm committed to making it work. Lady Valeira and I have agreed to approach this as partners, figuring out how to build a life together. It's not the path I expected my life to take, but it's the path I'm on now. The sharp-eyed official turned to Valeira. And you, Lady Valeira? How do you view this binding? We've heard you had other suitors, other plans. Some might suspect you harbor resentment toward Commander Cross. Valeira's expression remained perfectly composed, but Ethan felt a flash of irritation through the bond before she replied. The binding was necessitated by law and circumstance. I chose to honor that law rather than demand execution. Ethan Cross has proven himself capable of adapting to our ways with remarkable speed. While this was not the future I envisioned, I do not believe it will be a terrible one. We are both intelligent beings capable of compromise and growth. That is sufficient foundation. It was possibly the most diplomatic way of saying, I'm making the best of a bad situation, that Ethan had ever heard. But it seemed to satisfy the officials, who nodded and made notes on their data pads. Very well, Ambassador Chin said after a long moment. Commander Cross, the diplomatic corps is prepared to support your binding as a valid exercise of Nixarian law and to recognize your new status as a member of House Crimson Thorn by marriage. However, you will still be expected to fulfill certain obligations to the Terran colonial government, including regular reports on your well-being and on any information relevant to human-Nixarian relations that you become privy to through your position. I understand, Ambassador. Though I should note that as a member of House Crimson Thorn, I'll also have obligations to them that may sometimes conflict with Terran interests. We're aware. Which is why we'll be assigning a liaison officer to help you navigate those conflicts when they arise. Chin stood, signaling the end of the meeting. You found yourself in an unprecedented situation, Commander. Try not to create an interstellar incident. I'll do my best, ma'am. After the officials left, Ethan slumped in his chair, the adrenaline that had been sustaining him draining away. That went better than I expected. They were testing us, Valeira said, moving to stand before one of the living wood walls. Seeing if our stories aligned, if there were inconsistencies they could exploit. You handled it adequately. High praise. It is, actually. She turned to face him. You are learning quickly, Ethan. How to speak with precision, how to present the narrative that serves our interests, how to navigate the political currents that will surround us. These are skills that many humans never develop, even those who live among us for years. Ethan studied her, trying to read the expression on her alien but beautiful face. Through the bond, he could sense something that might have been approval, might have been surprise. I had good teachers in the military. They drilled into us that in diplomatic situations, every word matters. Indeed. Valeira was quiet for a moment, then added, You should know that news of our binding has spread throughout the Imperium. Other houses are curious. We will receive invitations to formal gatherings, requests for audiences, challenges to your worthiness. The next few months will be a gauntlet of social and political tests. Fantastic. Ethan rubbed his face. And I'm still trying to figure out which foods won't kill me. To his surprise, Valeira laughed. An actual laugh, not just the almost smile she'd been offering. The sound was unexpectedly musical, a cascade of notes that seemed to resonate with the bioluminescent symbols on the walls. Your priorities are refreshingly practical. Come. If you're going to survive the social gauntlet, you need to build your strength. I will introduce you to the kitchens and ensure you have a supply of foods your transitioning body can process. Over the following days and weeks, Ethan and Valeira settled into a routine that was equal parts adaptation and negotiation. He learned the layout of House Crimson Thorn's sprawling compound, memorizing which corridors led where and which areas were restricted even to him. She taught him the formal modes of address for different ranks of vampires, the subtle gestures that conveyed respect or challenge, the intricate dance of Nyxarian court politics. His body continued to change, the episodes of pain decreasing in frequency but never fully disappearing. He noticed his reflexes improving, his strength increasing beyond what his human musculature should have been capable of. His senses sharpened. He could see more clearly in the dim lighting the vampires preferred, could hear conversations from rooms away, could distinguish scents with a precision that bordered on overwhelming. "Your human DNA is fighting the transformation," Veilira explained one evening as they shared a meal in her chambers. "It cannot be fully overwritten, you will always be fundamentally human at your core. But the binding is gradually introducing Nyxarian elements that will coexist with your original biology. You are becoming a hybrid, something that has no proper name in either of our languages." "Wonderful. I'm a biological experiment." But Ethan said it without real bitterness. He was alive, he was adapting, and he was beginning to see the advantages of his transformed state. "You are unique," Veilira corrected. "That has value in our culture. The Nyxarian Imperium prizes those who transcend easy categorization." They also began to understand each other beyond the formal partnership they'd agreed to. Ethan learned that Veilira was an accomplished scholar of ancient civilizations, that she maintained a private library of texts dating back thousands of years, that she had a dry wit that emerged when she was comfortable enough to relax her formal demeanor. She learned that he had a talent for strategy games, that he missed Earth's forests with an ache he rarely spoke about, that he viewed the universe with an optimism that her long-lived species had mostly abandoned. And slowly, carefully, the bond between them deepened beyond legal obligation. It wasn't love, not yet and perhaps never in the human sense, but it was genuine connection, built on mutual respect and the strange intimacy of being able to sense each other's emotions through their mystical link. 2 months after the binding, they attended their first major social event together, a gathering of the great houses to celebrate the founding of the Imperium. Ethan wore formal attire that Veilira had commissioned for him, black and crimson with intricate embroidery that marked him as both human and bound to crimson thorn. She wore a gown of midnight blue that seemed to be woven from captured starlight, her wings fully displayed in a statement of pride and power. They entered the gathering together, and Ethan felt every eye in the room turn toward them. Some gazes were curious, others hostile, a few appreciative of the spectacle they presented. The alien vampire princess and her human bondmate, an arrangement that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Lord Kale was there, of course, watching from across the room with an expression that suggested he was waiting for Ethan to make some catastrophic mistake. But Ethan had learned well in the past 2 months. He navigated the social intricacies with increasing confidence, remembered names and titles, engaged in the elaborate verbal sparring that passed for conversation among the vampire nobility. And when a young lord from a minor house made the mistake of suggesting that Veilira had lowered herself by binding to a human, Ethan responded with a smile that showed teeth. "On the contrary," he said smoothly, "I think Lady Veilira demonstrated remarkable wisdom. After all, she recognized potential where others saw only accident. That's the mark of a truly superior mind, wouldn't you say?" The exchange rippled through the nearby conversations, and Ethan saw Veilira's lips curve upward in approval. He defended her honor while simultaneously praising her judgment, a delicate balance that satisfied both their pride and the demands of Nyxarian social convention. Later, as they returned to their chambers, Veilira said, "You handled yourself well tonight. Better than many native Nyxarians would have in your position. I had a good teacher." Ethan removed his formal coat, relieved to be back in private. "And I'm motivated not to embarrass my bondmate." "Is that the only motivation?" Veilira asked, and there was something new in her voice, something almost teasing. Ethan turned to look at her, really look at her, seeing past the alien features and the impossible biology to the person beneath. "No," he admitted. "I'm starting to actually care about your opinion of me. About you." Veilira held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she crossed the space between them and placed her hand over his chest, over the mark that bound them together. I can feel your sincerity through the bond. And I should tell you, I am beginning to see you as more than an obligation. You surprise me, Ethan Cross. You adapt, you learn, you grow. These are qualities I value. Is that your way of saying you like me? Do not push your advantage, she said, but the almost smile was there again, warmer than before. Let us say that I find our arrangement less burdensome than I initially feared. Perhaps, given time, it may even become pleasant. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise of future affection. But for two beings from different worlds, bound by accident and law, learning to build something real from impossible circumstances, it was enough. It was a beginning. The seasons on Sangelios Prime followed a rhythm unlike anything Earth offered. The red sun's elliptical orbit created periods of deep crimson twilight that lasted for weeks, followed by intervals of near darkness where only the bioluminescent flora and the distant stars provided illumination. Ethan learned to mark time not by days but by cycles, measuring his new life in the ebb and flow of light that painted the Gothic spires of House Crimson Thorn. 6 months after the binding, Ethan woke to find the pain in his chest had finally ceased entirely. The transformation was complete. He rose from his resting platform and moved to the mirror, a recent addition to the chambers, installed at his request because Nyxarians rarely bothered with such things. The face that looked back at him was recognizably his own, but changed. His skin had taken on a slight pallor, not quite matching Veilira's luminescence but noticeably paler than his original complexion. His eyes remained brown, but flecks of crimson had appeared in the irises, visible when the light caught them at certain angles. His canine teeth had lengthened slightly, not true fangs but enough to be noticeable when he smiled. "You look troubled." Veilira's voice came from behind him, and he turned to find her in the doorway, already dressed for the day in flowing robes of deep green. "The transformation is complete. You should be celebrating." "I barely recognize myself," Ethan said quietly. "I look in the mirror and see someone who's not quite human anymore." Veilira moved to stand beside him, studying both their reflections. "You are not quite human. You are also not quite Nyxarian. You are what the binding made you, something new, something that exists in the space between our peoples." She paused. "Does this distress you?" Ethan considered the question. Did it distress him? He'd left behind his human life, his human future. He would outlive everyone he'd known before coming to Sangelios Prime. His body had been altered in ways that couldn't be reversed. By any rational measure he should be devastated. And yet, "No," he said slowly. "It doesn't distress me. It's just taking some getting used to." "You adapt well," Veilira observed. "Better than any of the other humans who've undergone binding. The bond between us grows stronger each day. I can feel your presence in my mind almost as clearly as I feel my own thoughts now. That should not be possible after only 6 months." It was true. The connection that had begun as a vague awareness had evolved into something far more intimate. Ethan could sense Veilira's emotions with increasing clarity, could sometimes even catch fragments of her thoughts when she was feeling particularly strongly about something. And he knew she could do the same with him, that his mind was becoming as transparent to her as hers was to him. "Is that normal?" he asked. "For the bond to develop this quickly?" "No. Most bonded pairs take decades to reach this level of connection." Veilira's expression was thoughtful. "There are theories about why some bonds develop faster than others. Compatibility of temperament, similarity of values, or simply genuine affection developing despite the circumstances of the binding." She said the last part carefully as though testing the words. Ethan met her eyes in the mirror, and through the bond he felt what she was feeling: uncertainty, hope, fear of rejection, desire for connection. It was a vulnerability she rarely showed, and he understood instinctively that this was a moment of significance. "I think," he said carefully, "that we've moved past obligation and into something real. I don't know what to call it. Friendship seems too weak. Love seems premature. But it's something." "Something," Veilira repeated, and her hand found his, her cool fingers intertwining with his warmer ones. "Yes, I feel it too. You have become important to me, Ethan Cross. More important than I expected or perhaps wanted. But I find I do not regret it. Before Ethan could respond, a sharp chime echoed through the chamber, a summons. Valira's expression shifted immediately to one of concern. That is Lady Serapha's call. She only uses that tone when something significant has occurred. They found Lady Serapha in her private study, a room lined with displays showing real-time data from across the territories controlled by House Crimson Thorn. The regent looked up as they entered, her expression grave. There has been a challenge, she said without preamble. Lord Kale of House Silverdusk has formally disputed the validity of your binding, claiming it was made under duress and without proper observance of all protocols. He has invoked the right of trial. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Trial? What does that mean? It means, Valira said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, that Kale is attempting to dissolve our binding through legal maneuvering. If he succeeds in proving the binding was improper, it will be annulled, and Ethan will be subject to the original penalty, execution. Can he actually do that? Ethan asked. The binding was witnessed by hundreds of vampires. Lady Serapha herself presided over it. The right of trial is ancient law, Lady Serapha explained. It allows any member of the assembled houses to challenge a binding if they believe proper protocols were not followed. Kale claims that Ethan was not given sufficient time to understand the implications of the binding before agreeing to it, and that therefore his consent was not truly informed. That's ridiculous, Ethan protested. I was given hours of instruction. Valira explained everything. Nevertheless, the challenge has been made and it must be answered. Lady Serapha stood, her wings spreading slightly in agitation. The trial will take place in 3 days before a tribunal of the great houses. You will both need to testify about the circumstances of the binding. And Ethan, she turned her crimson gaze on him. You will need to prove that you understood what you were agreeing to. That you entered the binding with full knowledge and free will. How do I prove that? By demonstrating your knowledge of Nyxarian law and customs. By showing that you have adapted to our ways with sufficient depth that your consent could not have been given in ignorance. Lady Serapha's expression softened slightly. In essence, you must prove you have become one of us despite your human origins. The 3 days before the trial were the most intense of Ethan's life. Valira drilled him relentlessly on every aspect of Nyxarian culture, law, and tradition. He memorized genealogies of the great houses, studied the intricate protocols that govern social interaction, learned the historical precedents for every major legal principle that might come up during the trial. They barely slept. Valira pushed him to his limits and beyond, demanding perfection in his responses, forcing him to think in Nyxarian rather than translating from English. She was merciless in her instruction, but Ethan understood why. If he failed, if the binding was annulled, he would die. And she would lose the bondmate she'd invested months in teaching, the partner she was beginning to genuinely care for. On the night before the trial, Ethan collapsed onto his resting platform, his mind spinning with information, his body exhausted despite its enhanced resilience. Valira sat beside him, and for once she looked as tired as he felt. I think you are as prepared as you can be, she said quietly. Tomorrow we will learn if it is enough. What happens if Kale wins? Ethan asked. If the binding is dissolved? Valira's hand found his, gripping tightly. I will fight to prevent your execution. I have some influence as third daughter of this house. But the law is absolute. If the binding is annulled, the original debt comes due. The most I could do is perhaps negotiate exile instead of death. Which would mean leaving you. Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Which would mean losing you. Ethan turned to face her fully, ignoring his exhaustion. Valira, listen to me. I want you to know something before tomorrow. In case things don't go well. Ethan. Let me say this. He squeezed her hand. When I first stumbled into your chambers, I was terrified. The binding was an escape from death, nothing more. But these past 6 months, you've become the most important person in my life. I don't know if it's love, I don't know if what we have can even be called that. But it's real. You're real to me. And I don't regret the binding. Not anymore. Even if it costs me my life tomorrow. Veolira's crimson eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. Ethan wasn't sure Nyxarians could cry, but the emotion behind her gaze was unmistakable. "You foolish, brave human," she said, her voice thick. "You have become essential to me. The bond we share is deeper than any I have known or heard of. If the tribunal annuls our binding, they will tear out a piece of my soul." She leaned forward, and for the first time since they'd met, she kissed him. It was gentle, cautious, a gesture of affection from a being who'd probably never been gentle or cautious in her long life. Ethan returned the kiss, feeling through the bond the storm of emotions she was experiencing: fear, hope, love barely acknowledged, determination to protect what they'd built. When they parted, Veolira rested her forehead against his. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that I will fight for us. For this improbable, impossible thing we have created." "Together," Ethan said. "Together," she agreed. The tribunal convened in the great hall of House Crimson Thorn, but the gathering was even larger than the one that had witnessed the original binding. Representatives from every major house in the Imperium had arrived to observe the proceedings, drawn by the novelty of a binding challenge and the political implications it carried. The hall thrummed with barely suppressed energy, the assembled vampires creating an atmosphere of expectation and judgment. Ethan and Veolira stood before a raised platform where 5 vampires sat in judgment, Lady Serapha in the center, flanked by 2 elders from other houses whose names Ethan had memorized but whose presence still intimidated him. These were creatures who'd lived for millennia, who'd witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, who viewed a 6-month binding as barely worth noting in the scope of their existence. Lord Kale stood across from them, looking confident and dangerous in formal robes of silver and black. His legal advocate, a thin vampire with eyes like chips of ice, clutched a data pad filled with what Ethan assumed were precedents and arguments. Lady Serapha called the tribunal to order, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. "We are gathered to hear the challenge brought by Lord Kale of House Silverdusk against the binding of Veolira of House Crimson Thorn and Ethan Cross of Terra. Let the challenge be stated." Kale stepped forward, his bearing that of someone absolutely certain of victory. "Honored elders, I challenge this binding on the grounds that the human Ethan Cross could not have given informed consent to an eternal binding. He had been among our people for mere days when the incident occurred. He had no understanding of our culture, our laws, or the implications of the eternal binding. His consent, therefore, was given in ignorance and under duress. I ask that the binding be annulled and the original debt be allowed to come due." The words hung in the air, a death sentence wrapped in legal language. Ethan felt Veolira's hand tighten on his arm, felt through the bond her surge of protective fury. But she remained silent, waiting for the tribunal to respond. Lady Serapha turned her gaze to Ethan. "Ethan Cross, you have heard the challenge. How do you answer?" Ethan stepped forward, grateful that his months of training kept his voice steady despite the fear hammering in his chest. "I answer that while my time among the Nyxarian people was brief at the moment of binding, I was given sufficient instruction to understand the nature of what I was agreeing to." Lady Veolira explained the implications, the transformation, the permanence. "I chose the binding with full knowledge that it would change my life irrevocably. That was informed consent, not ignorance." "But you did not understand our culture," Kale interjected. "You could not have comprehended what it truly means to be bound to a Nyxarian house, to live for centuries among beings fundamentally different from yourself. Your human perspective was too limited to grasp the reality of what you were agreeing to." One of the elder judges, a female vampire with white hair that flowed like liquid, leaned forward. "The challenger raises a valid point. How can we be certain that a human with only days of exposure to our civilization could provide the level of informed consent our laws require?" This was the moment Veolira had prepared him for. Ethan drew a breath and switched from English to flawless Nyxarian, speaking in the formal mode of address used in legal proceedings. "Honored elder, may I demonstrate my understanding through examination?" The white-haired elder's eyebrows rose slightly, surprised that he could speak formal Nyxarian, perhaps, or interest in his proposal. "Proceed." What followed was the most intense oral examination Ethan had ever experienced. The 5 judges took turns questioning him on every aspect of Nyxarian culture and law they could think of. They asked him to recite the genealogies of the great houses, to explain the historical origins of the binding ritual, to describe the proper protocols for territorial negotiations between houses. They challenged him on points of etiquette, on religious observances, on the subtle distinctions between different levels of formal address. Ethan answered every question, drawing on the months of instruction and the knowledge that Veolyra had drilled into him with relentless precision. He spoke in proper Nyxarian, switching between dialects when appropriate, demonstrating not just memorization but genuine understanding of the concepts underlying their civilization. He saw Kale's confidence begin to waver as the examination continued. He saw surprise and then grudging respect appear on the faces of several judges. And through the bond, he felt Veolyra's pride and hope building like a rising tide. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes, Lady Serapha raised a hand for silence. I believe we have heard sufficient demonstration of the respondent's knowledge. Let us address the core question. Can this human be said to have given informed consent? The white-haired elder spoke first. I am impressed. In 6 months, this human has acquired knowledge that many young Nyxarians do not possess after decades. His understanding of our culture is not superficial. He grasps the underlying principles and can apply them contextually. This suggests a depth of instruction and dedication to learning that undermines the claim of ignorant consent. Another elder, this one with features that looked carved from stone, nodded slowly. I agree. Moreover, the depth of the bond itself speaks to genuine compatibility and commitment. The connection between these two is stronger than many bonds I have witnessed that were made with full cultural knowledge on both sides. Whatever began as accident has evolved into something legitimate. Kale's advocate tried to interject, but Lady Serapha cut him off with a gesture. The tribunal has heard the arguments and seen the evidence. We will now deliberate. The 5 judges engaged in a whispered consultation that Ethan's enhanced hearing could almost but not quite make out. He stood with Veolyra, their hands clasped, both of them barely breathing as their fate was decided. Through the bond, they shared their fear and hope, creating a feedback loop of emotion that was either deeply comforting or utterly terrifying. Ethan couldn't decide which. Finally, Lady Serapha turned back to face the assembly. The tribunal has reached a decision. We find that while the initial circumstances of the binding were irregular, the human Ethan Cross has demonstrated sufficient understanding of Nyxarian culture and law to constitute informed consent. Moreover, the strength of the bond and the clear compatibility of the pair suggest that the binding has become legitimate through commitment and growth. The challenge is denied. The binding of Veolyra of House Crimson Thorn and Ethan Cross of Terra stands affirmed. The hall erupted in noise, some vampires applauding the decision, others clearly disappointed at the outcome. Ethan felt his legs nearly give out with relief, felt Veolyra sag against him. Through the bond came a rush of joy and gratitude so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. But they weren't finished. Lady Serapha raised her hand for silence once more. However, Lord Kale, you invoked your right under ancient law to bring this challenge. While the tribunal finds against you, we recognize that your concerns, though ultimately unfounded, were not entirely without merit given the unusual circumstances. No penalty will be imposed for bringing this challenge. Kale inclined his head, accepting the judgment with visible reluctance. But as he turned to leave, he caught Ethan's eye, and the look he gave was one of grudging respect rather than hostility. Perhaps, Ethan thought, the trial had actually accomplished something positive. It had forced him to prove his worthiness not just to Kale but to the entire Imperium. As the assembled vampires began to disperse, Ethan and Veolyra stood together in the center of the great hall, their bonds singing with shared relief and triumph. They had survived the trial. The binding had been affirmed. They were, officially and unquestionably, eternal partners. You were magnificent, Veolyra said quietly. The way you answered their questions, the depth of knowledge you demonstrated. Ethan, you made them see you as one of us. That is no small achievement. I had a good teacher, Ethan replied. And a powerful motivation. I wasn't going to let them take you away from me. Veolyra's hand cupped his face, and her crimson eyes searched his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "When I first saw you standing in my doorway, I thought you were the end of my carefully planned future. But you have become the beginning of something I never knew I wanted. A partner who challenges me, who grows with me, who has proven himself worthy of standing beside me. So what you're saying is you're glad I stumbled through the wrong door?" She laughed, that musical sound that seemed to resonate with the architecture around them. "Do not let it go to your head, human. But yes, I am glad. Impossibly, inexplicably glad." They left the great hall together, walking through corridors that no longer felt quite so alien to Ethan, heading toward chambers that had become home. The trial was over. The binding was secure. And ahead of them stretched centuries of possibility, of learning and growing and building something unprecedented. A bridge between two species, embodied in the unlikely bond between a human commander and an alien vampire princess. 5 years after the binding, Ethan stood on the observation deck of House Crimsonthorn's highest spire, looking out over the landscape of Sangelios Prime. The red sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of crimson and gold. In the distance he could see other territories, Silver Dusk to the north, Onyx Dawn to the east, the newer human settlements on the southern continent where the Terran colonial government had established a permanent presence. "You are thinking loudly." Veilira's voice came from behind him, and he smiled without turning around. "Just reflecting on how much has changed," Ethan said. 5 years ago, I was a military officer who'd never seen an alien civilization up close. Now I'm a recognized member of the Imperium's diplomatic corps, an official liaison between humanity and the Nyxarian houses, and bound to one of the most powerful vampires in the territories. Veilira moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity of long practice. "You have exceeded every expectation I had, Ethan Cross. You've become not just a competent member of our society but a true force within it. The proposals you drafted for human Nyxarian cultural exchange programs have been adopted by 3 houses. Your mediation work has prevented 2 potentially violent disputes. You are making a difference." "We are making a difference," Ethan corrected. "I couldn't do any of this without you." "True." Veilira's lips curved in the smile that had become increasingly common over the years. "But you bring something to our partnership that I could never have found elsewhere. A fresh perspective, an optimism that my people lost millennia ago, a belief that different species can find common ground. These are valuable qualities." Ethan turned to face her fully, taking in her beauty that he'd long since stopped thinking of as alien. She was simply Veilira, his partner, his bondmate, the most important person in his increasingly long life. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now though they'd taken him 3 years to say the first time. "I know we joke about our accidental beginning, but I genuinely love you. I choose you every day. Not because of the binding but because of who you are." Veilira's expression softened, her crimson eyes warm. "I love you too, my impossible human. You forced your way into my life through the most absurd circumstances imaginable, and now I cannot envision existence without you. We are something unprecedented, a true union of our peoples. And I suspect we are merely the beginning." She was right, Ethan knew. In the 5 years since their binding, 3 more human Nyxarian bindings had occurred, all voluntary, all between individuals who'd taken the time to truly know each other before making the commitment. The precedent he and Veilira had set, proved through their trial and strengthened through their genuine partnership, had opened the door for others to follow. "Lady Serapha has asked if we would consider hosting the next diplomatic summit," Veilira said, changing the subject. "She believes our chambers have become symbolic of human Nyxarian cooperation. What do you think?" Ethan considered the proposal, the logistical challenges, the political implications, the opportunity to further the cause they'd inadvertently championed. "I think," he said slowly, "that it's a terrible amount of work that will stress us both to our limits. And I think we should absolutely do it. Because that's what we're here for, to build bridges, to create connections, to prove that the most unexpected partnerships can become the strongest." Veilira nodded, satisfaction clear in her expression. "Then we are agreed." She paused, then added, You know, there is one tradition we have not yet observed. The binding gave us legal union, but in my culture, there is another ceremony, a personal vow exchange that bonded pairs undertake when they know they have built something lasting. A vow exchange? Ethan felt his heart rate pick up. Like, a renewal of vows? Similar. But more intimate. Not the formal spectacle of the binding, but a private commitment between partners who have proven their bond through years of shared experience. Her eyes held his. I would like to undertake this ceremony with you, Ethan. Not because law or tradition demands it, but because I want to mark what we have become. Ethan felt emotion well up in his chest, joy, gratitude, love so deep it bordered on overwhelming. This was the woman who'd threatened him with execution when they first met, who'd been forced into a partnership she never wanted, who'd every reason to resent him. And she was asking to commit to him again, freely this time, out of genuine desire rather than necessity. Yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, I want that. I want to promise myself to you again, knowing everything I know now, having lived this life we've built. They stood together on the observation deck as the red sun sank below the horizon, planning their private ceremony, discussing the future projects they wanted to undertake, simply existing in each other's presence with the comfort of partners who'd been through trials and emerged stronger. Somewhere in the compound below, life continued. Vampires going about their eternal business, human visitors navigating the complexities of Nyxarian culture, the slow but steady work of two civilizations learning to coexist. And at the heart of it all was an unlikely couple, bound by accident and law, who transformed obligation into genuine love and partnership. Ethan Cross had stumbled through the wrong door and discovered the right future. Valira of House Crimson Thorn had lost the life she'd planned and found something far better. Together they were writing a new story, not of humans and vampires, but of two beings who'd crossed every conceivable boundary to build something unprecedented. And they had centuries ahead to continue writing it.